I'm going to start with the first two slides. I'm showing you on the left a painting. Can you hear me? Yes. Like this, you want it closer. A painting of the Salon of 1874 in Paris, which coincidentally was the year of the first Impressionist exhibition. And on the right, I'm showing you a slide I took at the Metropolitan Museum of the Impressionist galleries a few weeks ago. What you see are, while not exactly the same frames, a similar presentation of all these pictures in very sumptuous gilded frames. But what we know of the Impressionists was that they rejected the Salon and the dictates of the Academy in terms of their subject matter and their paint application, and also in the way that they presented their pictures. Contemporary accounts of Impressionist exhibitions describe a very different approach to the way these pictures were framed at the time. And it's very different from the way American museums tend to present them today.
As a frame designer, I was amazed to learn that some of the Impressionists had designed their own frames. And they went far beyond choosing the available moldings and ornaments and combining them in new ways. What they did was really a radical departure, and it was recognized by many of their contemporaries. Jules Laforgue, who was a young poet and critic, a contemporary of the Impressionists, wrote with great enthusiasm about their frames. He wrote that they have substituted intelligent, refined, imaginative frames for the old gilt frames which are the stock in trade of academic convention. A green, sunlit landscape, a white winter beach, an interior with dazzling lights and colorful clothes require different sorts of frames which the respective painters alone can provide. Some of the new frames are in solid colors, natural wood, white, pink, green, jonquil yellow, and others are lavish combinations of colors and styles. What these artists were trying to do was something very different from what they had seen all around them. So what did their new frame designs look like? How did their dealers and collectors respond to their experiments? And why is it that today what we see largely are Baroque and Rococo frames, frames that were chosen by others, not designed by the artists, as we see in these images here? These are the questions we'll address tonight. And first, woo.
I knew it was going to get exciting.
That was actually, I like that. First, okay, let's see, yes. This Sicily on the right from 1872 is installed in a typical late 19th century pastiche frame. At that time, carving, true hand carving, was often replaced by a material which we call campo, which could be cast again and again, always the same, resulting in a monotonous sameness to the frames that this ornament adorned. In many cases, real gold was replaced by imitation gold leaf. The frame designer Robert Kulick has stated the case very clearly. He wrote, "The 19th century becomes the dark ages of the frame-making craft. The 19th century product was so impossible that dealers and collectors were forced to use frames of other periods for the important 19th century paintings. The important point is that for the first time since the Renaissance, contemporary frames could not be found for contemporary pictures." By the late 1870s, both Degas and Pissarro had begun designing their own frames. And here on the left, we have a page from Degas' sketchbook from 1878-79 with frame profiles. And on the right, his pastel, a portrait of friends, pastel from 1879. And you can see all, let's see, oh, I have a pointer, all these varieties of reeded and fluted profiles. These two here are pretty much the models for this frame. This is an actual Degas frame. It's a convex profile, as you see, often known as a cushion frame, no ornament at all, only the reeds cut into the surface. One quite unusual aspect of the frame for its time is that the cross-section itself, the profile, is virtually symmetrical. That is to say, it rises up from the sight edge of the picture and descends to the wall. It rises up from the wall and descends to the picture quite equally. It addresses the picture edge no differently than it addresses the wall. Now, on the left here is a picture that Buffy took at Musée d'Orsay, and this is the same frame, and this is actually a better color likeness. The frame is, in fact, green. The form of a cushion frame was unusual for the time, but not entirely without precedent, as we will see in a few minutes. But a colored, a painted frame, this was something truly novel in presenting pictures. Unfortunately, very few of the Impressionist frames exist. So we're going to see the Cassatt here on the left, the Mary Cassatt with no frame. The frame, the original frame, doesn't exist. She showed this painting, A Box at the Opera, in a green frame at the 1879 Impressionist exhibition. She painted the frame a complementary color to these dominant reds. Critics responded similarly to the frames as they did to the paintings. That is to say, there was a mixed response. Renoir's younger brother, the critic Edmond Renoir, wrote, "Mary Cassatt, frames smeared with red or green, which are truly ugly and in the worst taste." On the other hand, the critic Deborah Hay found that he found her portraits ingeniously framed. In the 8 Impressionist exhibitions, which began in 1874 and continued into the 80s, they continued to experiment with the display of their works. There are really virtually no visual records. There are no visual records whatsoever of the exhibitions, only contemporary reports. One tells us that in 1880, Pissarro's room was lilac with a canary yellow border, and his works were framed in complementary colors. Huysmans wrote, "The complementary tones of the room as a whole were echoed in the prints, which had yellow mats and purple frames." Now, these were not merely decorative effects sought by the Impressionists. The colors they chose to surround their works were calculated to enhance the vibrancy of the colors in their paintings.
Degas wasn't the only one inventing this style of frame, and I'm showing you here Whistler's arrangement in Gray and Black #1 from 1870-71, which you may know as Whistler's mother. Degas' reeded cushion frame is simpler on the right than Whistler's, and in a way you can think of it perhaps as a distillation of Whistler's idea. Whistler had begun designing frames in the early 1870s, in part inspired by the Pre-Raphaelites. That's kind of another lecture, so I'm not going to go into it, but Degas and Whistler were very aware of each other's work in frame design, causing Whistler to state, "I wish this to be also clearly stated in Paris that I am the inventor of all this kind of decoration, that I may not have a lot of clever little Frenchmen trespassing on my ground." So the similarity in the look of these frames was also keenly felt by the artists themselves. This picture was purchased by the French National Museums in 1890. Even though it had been painted in the 70s, it may originally have been in a different kind of frame. This is the kind of frame that he was designing later on. But what it does to the picture, here I show you a detail. It creates a feeling of depth, an actual three-dimensional tactile reality of depth, which allows you to sort of go into the picture, which is assertively flat. Everything in the picture denies a pictorial space which has any illusion to depth. Whistler's mother sits in a very shallow and monochromatic space. So the depth of the experience of looking at the picture is actually contributed by the frame. If you want to look at a great survey of Whistler frames in one place in New York, you should go to the Frick, which it surprised me to realize actually there's a landscape in the court with the pool, which shows you a version of an early Whistler frame, which is very Japanese and painted, very beautiful. And then the 4 portraits that I always had thought had exactly the same frame, actually each frame is different one from the other, so it's a good place to go and look.
Okay, we have Degas' portrait of friends again on the left, and his painting, this is a pastel on the left, and the painting on the right, Portrait at the Bourse from 1879. This one on the right is in what might well have been considered quite an austere frame for the time. It's a neoclassical frame, very common in the late 19th century. Its ornaments, such as in particular, the acanthus leaves in the corner, are certainly refer to antiquity and a common Greek ornament. And the fluting along the cove, along the sides, bristles out from the picture edge. And I think one quality of these corners that maybe I think it's visible is a sort of exclamatory quality they have in the diagonal of the miter. All the elements of the reeded frame of Degas' design on the left are parallel to the edge of the canvas. It's really a set of concentric rectangles. The organic references are completely eliminated. And one of the consequences, which is rather interesting to me, is that the miters become increasingly apparent and important in a frame that's so spare. The miters on the left side leading the eye into the image, and the ones at the right really sitting on the surface where there's this brown mass.
One thing that I always think of as a curator is often you're presented with a picture that needs a new frame for whatever reason. The frame has fallen apart, or you purchase a picture or get bequeathed a picture that comes without a frame, and you have to make choices. And it is the rare example of an original Degas frame of which only a handful survive. But my sort of question that I put out to you to ponder is, on the right you see a much more conventional solution to the Degas frame on the left, and I must say that on the left you're looking at a pastel, and it's much more freely executed than the oil painting on the right. So I should make that clear. On the other hand, I think it's important to ponder the effect that the Degas frame has on the picture, and whether you feel it expresses more or allows the picture to express more the modernity of his pictorial construction. And so I just think that's something you should keep in mind as we continue to talk.
Now there are two frames we associate with Degas. We've just seen one, and these two represent the other. These frames with a wide panel and a narrow outer rail are commonly called passe-partout frames, a passe-partout being a window mat used for works on paper. The term is sometimes used in English as well for a window mat. So even though both of these are paintings from 1869, the Madame Gobillard on the left and the Collector of Prints from 1866 on the right, they're both framed in what look like print frames, which might well be a reason why dealers didn't favor them. The frame on the left, I think, is just remarkably modern. This is a sort of frame that we do today, both on paintings and on works on paper. The panel works effectively like a mat. It offers a field surrounding the work. There are no incidents whatsoever to distract the eye from the picture. There's no ornament, there's no content. This void isolates the picture, and the outer rail provides, very simply, a strong border. The one on the right, the print collector, is very similar, but the outer rail is grooved. And you can note that at the very top, you can see the shadow of the outer rail on the panel, and so the panel provides enough separation from the picture that no shadows cast on it. These plain frames, both styles we've looked at of Degas, reinforce the edge and the shape of the canvas. All these very simple forms of ornament, rails, ripples, reeds, and flutes, run parallel to the perimeter. Now, both of these pictures were bequeathed to the Met by the Havemeyers. Louisine Havemeyer collected Degas rather early. In fact, he was the first impressionist she bought. And she writes in her memoir, she was very sensitive to his wishes in framing, and she writes in her memoir that Degas wished the frame to harmonize and to support his pictures and not to crush them as an elaborate gold frame would do. The first thing I did to many a Degas that we purchased from amateurs was to remove the atrocious heavy gold frame, which the owners probably thought gave the picture more importance, and to restore it to its original frame when possible, or provide it with one Degas could approve.
I just thought I'd take a second to contrast the pictorial and spatial relationships between this frame and picture and what we saw in the Whistler. Here, I think if you go to the Met, there are two things that you notice right away. One is the dullness of the gold, and actually next week we're going to go and look at these under a microscope and see if indeed they were originally painted and not gilded. But even now the gold is very dull. And the flatness, which is very assertive on the wall, in contrast to the Whistler, where the painting itself asserted the flatness of the canvas in a certain way, here the flatness is juxtaposed or sort of posed against a very complicated spatial recession in the pictures, which kind of revolve around corners and the shapes of frames. Here in both of these pictures, Thérèse Gobillard and the print collector, you see a frame cut off, which sort of sets up the composition. And here you get door frames, window frames receding into depth. That really is heightened, I think, by the flatness of the frame itself. Here I show you what art historians have as documentation to do research, which is the page on the print collector from the retrospective catalog that was, the exhibition was organized by the Musée d'Orsay and the Metropolitan Museum. This is one of, as I said, a handful of extant original Degas frames, and yet even then it doesn't make it into the photograph. And this is the authoritative reference work on Degas and on this picture. And this is how art history is depicted in a way. The pictures are naked. They are not in their frames, and part of that is obviously because frames can change according to who owns them. It's through the frame that often the owner asserts his ownership of the work, but it shows you why all these slides were taken with our cameras and made into slides. There is no record of what paintings look like on the wall, and this retrospective page bears testament to that.
On the left, we have another sketch from Degas' sketchbook. This is from 79 through 82. This is the profile that he sketched for the frame on the right. It's the detail of the last one we saw, the collector of prints. This frame was given a name by Signac. He called it the chemin de fer frame because it looked like railroad tracks. Signac himself used this style of frame and a number of variants on it, often on his work. In the Signac show at the Met right now, there are 6 or 7 of them. One of them we made, and perhaps if you look carefully you can pick it out, but I hope you can't. Now, the first Impressionist work bought by Louisine Havemeyer was a Degas pastel, and she exhibited it in 1878 in New York at the National Academy of Design. The rules dictated gold frames here in New York as they did at the Salon in France. So the delicate gray and green frame was generously treated to a coating of bright bronze paint. This was done without her permission. She went to the opening and was shocked to find this result. Since it had been framed by Degas, she restored the frame as best she could after the exhibition to its gray-green color. Now on the right, we have a pastel from 1879, Dancer Resting. This in a white chemin de fer frame. Buffy mentioned that the collector of prints was possibly white. This is one of the few or only white frames still in existence. In the 1877 Impressionist exhibition, both Degas and Pissarro hung pictures in white frames. The Impressionists were influenced by the chemist and color theorist Chevreul. Chevreul himself experimented with the colors of frames and mats on prints. And it was probably his writing which had influenced Mary Cassatt and others to use colored frames on their works. Chevreul wrote that white placed beside a color heightens its tone, and the Impressionists must have agreed, since throughout the late 70s and into the 80s, some of their frames were painted white. Degas felt very strongly about his frame designs. He resisted the efforts of collectors to choose their own. There's a story of a visit he paid for dinner to the home of a friend who was also a collector of his work. The collector had reframed a Degas that had been in one of his own frames in an ornate gold frame. At the end of the meal, as the story goes, Degas took it off the wall, took a small coin out of his pocket, pried the nails out of the back, put the picture under his arm, and walked off with it, saying, so it is said, you can't even trust your friends. Now, this sketch page from the left, these frames are so different from anything we've seen. So far as we know, they were never made in Degas' lifetime. A few years ago, I visited the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris to see these sketchbooks for myself. Up to that point, I'd only seen small reproductions in books. You know, in books, the reproductions were maybe an inch wide. But in fact, I was startled to note, holding the sketchbook in my hand, that these drawings were about 5 inches wide. So in fact, they were pretty close to what we would call a shop drawing. They were done full scale for a frame to be made from them.
And I just want to interject as the art historian that often for art historians, it's sufficient to use a reproduction to get the information that you need, and you're not at all aware of the importance of seeing the original if it's a document. And in collaborating on this project with Judd, who's a framer, he's the only one I know who could have looked at a 5-inch diagram and said, oh, this is to scale for an actual frame. It's something that's never been noted by anybody before. And so I think it's not just looking at the original documents, but also collaborating with somebody who does something completely different that really enables you to understand much more what the artist was intending.
This frame, which was copied, a rendition of it was made by the Art Institute of Chicago, which is shown on the right, I think is really an extraordinary design. There is no precedent for it that I can think of. I'd be interested if anyone here can think of one ever in the history of frames. It's very much, I think, a sculptural frame, and of course he was a sculptor. He's taken, I'm looking now at the lower right profile. That's the one that was rendered on in the slide to the right. He's taken this one curve, convex, and then it's really the shape of the cushion almost that we've seen before, but then he's taken these bites out of it, these concave bites on the right. I think it's quite a brilliant frame. On the right, do we have a detail of that? Yeah. This is interesting, actually. As you'll note, that the site at the side edge, the detail is not the same as this. They modified it really to make the side edge more conventional. There are a couple of little steps there instead of the continuation of these curves down to the very side edge, which in some respects is one of the most radical aspects of it. It's too bad they didn't do it exactly as he'd intended it.
Yeah, it's funny when you think about having a reproduction frame. I mean, we were commenting on this, that it's very hard to have a complete reproduction, that reproduction is so informed by who you are when you're making the reproduction that often it's not at all exactly what the original intentions were. Just to show you that Degas was not alone, this is a rare example of a frame on a kaya butt of Monsieur Gallo and his dog Dick that is owned by private collectors in London, but it's occasionally on view at the Met, and it goes up and down in the galleries, but you actually can have a chance to see it. It's in New York. And we actually went to see the collector, and it's a famous frame as being originally from the time Kaya Butt gave the picture to the family from which this collector bought it. So it had always been in the same family. And the collector was saying how frustrated he was to have been given the legacy of this frame, because he would have loved to have put it in a 17th century gilded frame, and felt compelled because of its importance to keep it in this frame. You see, it's flat, and it takes off on the chemin de fer edge of the Degas that you've seen, but it is a story about why collectors feel compelled to change their frames over time.
There are a number of sort of old stories and myths about Impressionist frames. One I read recently, repeated by a New York City French frame specialist, who said the original Impressionist frame is very simple. They had no money. But this gives the lie to that statement, because Caillebotte was a very wealthy man. As you may well know, he collected a lot of paintings of his colleagues. And so he chose, presumably, this frame because he liked it, not because he could afford better. So let's look at the Renoir. The sketch. This is, on the left, a very late sketch by Renoir, 1918, as you can see in the lower right. And young girls at the piano, 1892 painting in the Lehman collection. Well, in regard to frames, Renoir took a completely different path from his colleagues. He preferred 18th century frames, especially Rococo Louis XV frames like the one on the right. At least this is what we know from the last years of his life, and little is known about his frame choices in the 70s and 80s, but there's no information whatsoever that he ever designed frames of his own. He, however, shared with his peers one important point of view, and that was a disdain for the assembly line produced frames of their time. Above all, he loved the genuine article, the frame carved and gilded by a skilled craftsman. And that stands to reason. He was the only Impressionist from an artisanal background. His father was a tailor. He himself was a porcelain painter as a teenager. And he was a great admirer of craft. He also admired French painting of the 18th century, Fragonard portraits of women in particular. And here's a Fragonard, The Love Letter from the Met, 1770. I think Renoir would have loved this frame. He welcomed authentic frames brought to him by collectors, and sometimes he did make paintings for them. And this is well documented in his biographies by Saint-Jean and by the dealer Vollard. Apparently he's the only Impressionist who followed this practice, but I remember hearing the claim among framers as I was coming up in this profession that this was a common practice of the Impressionists. I imagine thinking that was good for the framers' self-esteem, but I don't think it was true.
Now I'm going to show you, we're going to segue into how the painters compromised their frames to the desires of the dealers and collectors. And in addition to the Havemeyers, who admired the frames of the Impressionists, as we've seen with Degas, here I show you two Degas pastels that were owned by Isaac de Camondo. And you'll notice when you go to the Musée d'Orsay that for the most part he owned more than 30 Degas. He also owned an extraordinary collection of 18th century furniture, which makes the spareness of these frames, I think, more remarkable. But apparently they were developed in concert with the dealer Durand-Ruel and with the approval of the artist himself. And what you'll note is the white slip around the picture itself. But again, these are pastels. In terms of compromise, I have nothing to quote from Degas, though Pissarro, at exactly this time in the late 80s, wrote to his dealer that he had foreseen the difficulties with white frames that risked provoking another huge cry of protest. So I, Pissarro writes, took the decision to have frames made in oak with a laurel border of gold on the outside and bands of white on the painting, so that thus transformed, I thought to reconcile the harmony of the other frames with mine without destroying the harmony of my paintings. Alas for Pissarro, the dealer Petit painted over the white slip right before the show. He painted it over with gold. And Jed is going to just articulate for you some things that I was not used to looking at when I was looking at the pattern and decoration on frames.
Well, there's a subtle difference between these two, and it has to do with the ribbon and stick ornament around the perimeter. This one runs continuously in one direction around the outside of the frame. So the vector is really around the rectangle. It reinforces the edge, as all of Degas' designs do. This, on the other hand, meets in the corners and meets in the center. So it reinforces the diagonal, reinforces the miter, and really focuses toward the center of the picture. And in this respect, even though it's a very simple frame indeed, it's considerably more traditional in its impact than the one on the left.
And here I show you a photograph of a picture at the Met in what is thought to be an original Havemeyer frame. And what's emerging is this idea that Duron-Ruel perhaps designed different frames for different collectors. And when we proposed this idea to a curator from Chicago who was standing next to a curator from Boston, he looked at him and he said, I always knew the Chicago frames were narrower than the Boston frames. And so I think there is the feeling, it takes a while to actually measure these things, but I think there is something to the theory that we might pursue. And you see in the Havemeyer frame, it takes off from some aspects of Degas' own design and some things that you also see in the Camelot frame. Here I show you the living room of the dealer Duron-Ruel from 1897. And if you can see them, the frames in the living room are extremely austere. And I'll show you a detail in a minute. In contrast to the architectural molding that is quite sumptuous. So it was a deliberate choice of austerity and not certainly in any case by accident. In 1905, Duron-Ruel used these same frames for a large exhibition of over 100 pictures he sent to the Grafton Galleries in London. And you see every single picture, just like in his living room, is framed in the same frame. Here I show you one of the only pictures I've ever seen in one of these original Duron-Ruel frames, which is of a Monet from 1902 of Waterloo Bridge. And I think, again, I would ask you to ponder its impact. I think the bronze of the paint doesn't necessarily enhance the picture. I don't want to seem like austere frame. I don't want to make it seem that my opinion is all austere frames work best with pictures. I don't necessarily consider this the happiest of marriages, but it is interesting that Duron-Ruel put all his pictures in this frame. This is in contrast to a photograph from 1901 of the Duron-Ruel galleries in New York. And this is where I'm hoping to find the first legitimizations of my theory that Duron-Ruel deliberately made the Louis XIV and XV style taste for the American market, where he, in his own living room and in Europe, did not necessarily go in that direction. Though I show you a photograph of Duron-Ruel himself, and you see him with Barbizon pictures in very ornate frames. So I think it depended on the kind of picture also and the collector it was intended for, what kind of frame he would put pictures in. I just want to go back to the living room and show you the poplars again. I'm showing you on the right the painting of 4 poplars at the Met today. Why this is particularly of interest, it's not the same picture as in the living room, but you saw how he framed the poplars in his living room. In 1891, I don't know if you know, there was a public auction of the poplar trees that Monet was in the process of painting, and he actually paid to have the trees remain uncut until he finished his series. In 1892, he exhibited his poplar series at Duron-Ruel, and at the close of the exhibition, there's correspondence which documents Monet asking Duron-Ruel to return 5 paintings as well as 3 special frames. one white, one oak, and one he describes as made of 4 trees, presumably fashioned from the wood of 4 of the poplar trees that were felled after he finished his series. And that wood frame was for this painting of the 4 poplar trees, which has now been lost to us. So it would have been the actual wood of those 4 trees in the frame. I guess I've made that clear. Now I'm showing you the ultimate expression of a dealer frame. This is actually a Gainsborough at the National Gallery in Washington. So it's from 1786, a full 100 years earlier, but the frame is by Duveen, and you know that so much of what you see in the great collections was formed and bought for collectors by Duveen, and this is the real horror vacui of frame design, where there isn't, and it's beautifully executed and wonderfully carved, but there is not a surface that is untouched. In terms of early documentation, I've shown you some, but there is some phenomenal rare documentation, 3 photographs of which are actually at the Morgan Library, of the 1884 posthumous exhibition of Manet's work. It was the year after Manet had died, and a retrospective exhibition that was photographed. And I show you on the left how the Déjeuner sur l'herbe was presented at that time, which was in a frame I don't think either of us can really guess. It's hard to read these black and white photographs. I don't know whether we think it's a natural wood frame or somehow gilded, but for sure it's a flat surface that is all about size and scale, but not about decoration at all. Another interesting resource are photographs that I found in the archives of the Louvre of early installations at the Jeu de Paume. This is the 1947 presentation of the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, where you see it in a brown frame that makes it look quite ponderous. When you see the picture today at the Musée d'Orsay, it's in a 19th century gold frame, and one would easily think that it had always been in that frame, which we've learned from going back to archives is not the case. Another example is Manet's Pfeiffer, which on the left you see in the 1884 photograph, and on the right you see in the 1947 photograph at the Musée d'Orsay. When we were looking at these photographs, Jed had a eureka moment thinking that the Pfeiffer in the posthumous exhibition of 1884 is possibly in a white frame, because nobody knows what these white frames actually look like other than that one Degas dancer. And it's been surmised, I think, has it not, that maybe traditional shaped frames were painted white. And then here in looking at these photographs, I don't know that anybody who was looking at these photographs has actually ever been looking for this kind of information before, but that it might indeed be the case that it is a rare instance of a white frame. And then here I show you the 1958 reframing of the Pfeiffer after the Jeu de Paume had been closed for 4 years. They reopened it. It was also the time at which all the paintings were relined from 1954 to 58. And then here you see the Pfeiffer.
One interesting aspect here is that this frame on the left was made of sycamore wood, an unpainted wood. And its shape, its form, is not so different from the frame on the right or the one that we just before this on the left, which we think is probably white. But all the ornament has been stripped away, just the form remains. And this tactic is not so uncommon in European museums in the past 3 or 4 decades, to frame a 19th century picture in a kind of stripped down form of an unpainted wood with no ornament. And we haven't seen this, but I would hazard that it's probably not too successful a solution.
I'm going to talk now about Monet, who poses one of the biggest challenges to framing. Although Monet didn't design his own frames, he was very determined to exhibit his pictures in frames of his own choosing. And when he had an exhibition, he would require, if a painting had already been owned by a collector, to take that frame off and put his own frame on, or if a painting was purchased, he would ask for his own frame back, and the dealer would supply the frame to the collector. There's this apocryphal story of Monet on his deathbed with the Prime Minister of France, Clemenceau, by his side. And the story goes that Monet holds up 2 fingers, and that was to mean that that was the width of the frame that he wanted for his paintings for the Orangery. Now, people often say that's how wide Monet wanted all his frames. Well, certainly at the end of his life, when he was doing wall-size decorations, that was the case. But it's important for us to realize as we try to establish a repertoire of frames that over the course of an artist's life, his choice of frames and his tastes in frames can change. And it's actually said that there isn't a single Monet today that was in a frame that he provided. The most radical example of what has been done to Monet is actually, maybe you won't be surprised by this, but I was at the Jeu de Paume. On the left, I show you 1947, and on the right, in 1947, I should add, that was when it was the first French museum to open after the war, and there was tremendous excitement and anticipation about this. And it was the first time that the Jeu de Paume had been used for modern French paintings. Previously, modern foreign masters had been there. On the right, I show you how the Monets were presented in 1958. And Germain Bazin, who was the chief curator of the Louvre, wrote in 1947 about that installation that unframed, simply edged with paper, some of Monet's later paintings, which by their very nature are unsuitable for framing, were best framed like this, and that they were very well received. In 1958, he writes, the symmetrical method of hanging produced a monotonous effect. So Bazin adopted a so-called dynamic method of hanging, sometimes employed, as he said, in other countries for modern paintings. The paintings were therefore so arranged as to form a colored sequence in an arabesque. Now, I was thinking, the Monets, excuse me, are actually in the wall, and the wall is constructed on top of them as if it were a mat, in which the reveal is silvered. And I was thinking, what is he trying to do? And I was pondering, I mean, I'd be interested to know what you all think too, but I think what is the most exciting thing that somebody involved in the art world is thinking about in 1958, but abstract expressionism and what is going on in New York. And I think in taking the frames off and putting them in the wall, in some respect, he's making Monet into an action painter, and that's just my idea. But you can agree or disagree. I'm going to show you here the differences in presentation of Monet in New York and in France. On the left, we have the Grenouillère from the Met of 1869, and then on the right, painting of Zondam from 1871.
The frame on the right is reminiscent of the frame we saw on Degas' portrait at the Bourse, except that that frame had the flutes running along the sides and acanthus leaf corners. And so I think it's useful to look at this and think of the other. In my view, this simpler and unornamented frame feels more fitting for an Impressionist work than the more elaborate one we saw before.
I was really shocked when I started looking at frames to realize how austere the presentation of these early Impressionist pictures were at Orsay. And again, this is a 19th century frame, so it's not inappropriate to the time. Also, when I looked at how I think the Terrasse at Saint-Adresse at the Met is so well presented in a neoclassical style frame, I was shocked in going through archival pictures at the Met to realize that this was how it was presented in 1980 when the Mayer galleries opened. And so even when paintings get to museums, they change the way they look. And that brings me to a short discussion of what we have been doing at the Brooklyn Museum. I'm going to show you something that my former mentor, well, my continuing mentor and former colleague at the Brooklyn Museum is actually here tonight. And I don't know if you know this slide. I I had a new assistant, and I asked her to look for a slide of a Degas pastel. And here we see a pastel that came into the Brooklyn Museum in 1921 that was purchased at a Degas estate sale in a reeded cushion frame painted white. And I thought, oh my God, this could have been one of the few original Degas frames in white.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second.
Oh,
I just saw something I never saw before, which is in the lower left. There's a little ornament in the corner, which is sometimes called a strap. And it's odd because I think I see it down in the lower right too. I'm sharing with you a discovery. That suggests to me that very likely it was not an original Degas frame, or very possibly wasn't, since to the extent that we know of his designs, he didn't use those kinds of ornaments. But anyway, that'll throw you off.
Yeah, that ruins every point I had to make. Right. No, but the thing is, I mean, I don't know, Sarah, if you'd ever seen this before, but I hadn't seen it until this old slide surfaced, that maybe somewhere in the museum is this original or not white Degas frame. And now it's in a 19th century American frame where it looks fancy and important, but I was just astonished to see this. I'm going to show you two presentations of one of our most important pictures, Mademoiselle Fiacre by Degas from 1867. In another old slide I found in our slide drawer, which shows an early incarnation of it, and then it was reframed in 1978 in a pastiche frame, which is often the kind of thing you see at collectors' homes and in museums, a little corner ornament, a little center ornament, and then you have the frame. Having begun to look at frames, I was unhappy with this, and I took inspiration from one of the most important Degas painted during this time, which is the Bellelli family at the Musée d'Orsay. Why this is particularly compelling as an example is that Degas drew this frame in one of his notebooks, and this frame was made from that drawing. So it encouraged me, considering the scale and the context of our very large and grand, though austere galleries, to choose a large, grand, but simple molding frame from the 19th century that the picture is now in. This brings me to the last picture we are going to talk about tonight, one that to me had always defied framing solutions, which is, sorry about this. Oh, it's stuck, I think. You'll never know what I'm going to talk about, which is the Doge, thank you, the Doge's Palace by Monet from 1908. And the modernity of this picture fights with the other Monets that we own. When we install this picture on a wall, it often takes a wall by itself or a corner where you can focus on it, because although a horizontal landscape format, the verticality of the rectangles of the Doge's Palace and the reflection are so dominating that they really control everything around it. And I show you here how it looked in the frame that it was in until recently, which I thought did nothing to enhance the austerity and the modernity of the picture. One of the only indications that we have of the way a Monet looked during Monet's lifetime is in this painting by Vuillard, actually, of the Bernheim brothers, who were the ones who exhibited in 1912 all of Monet's Venice pictures. And you see how simple the frame around the Monet is. I'm now going to show you the frame that was designed by Judd for the picture, and how different it is from anything that we've seen before, while at the same time, Jed doesn't like this part of my talk, but I have always liked this frame around a Degas, which has been around this Degas since the 19th century at the Musée d'Orsay, which has a honeycomb pattern in its panel. And I don't think Jed was thinking about this at all when he designed the Monet frame, but I've always liked the way it caught the light differently and picked up the detail of the painting without dominating it or interfering with it. And I just show you both the similarities and the differences. Jed will talk about how the Monet frame is hand carved where the Degas is machine carved, but I think we should, there it is.
That's it, yeah.
Okay.
When Buffy and I collaborated on this design, we conceived a frame that moves in a series of steps from the domain of the picture to this plain and definite outer border which isolates the picture from the room. In the left-hand slide, there's an interesting aspect that doesn't have so much to do with the frame, but it has to do with the edge here. That the old frame covered quite a good deal of the border of the painting, and you can see there's a little bit of unpainted canvas showing on the left, and there are little bits here and there elsewhere, but there's also a lot more painting showing. More than 1/4 of an inch all around is now exposed, and if you do the arithmetic, that works out to over 40 square inches, which are now seen that were not seen before. Now, to speak of the frame, these were hand-carved flutes here. They're very short ones, and they read sort of as ripples, and they gradually step up from the picture plane, which you can't see in this flat image. Now, flutes, as you know, are a standard 19th century device for neoclassical frames, such as the portraits at the Bourse. But those were usually cast in campo, not carved, as these are. So these were carved in rather long flutes, and then they were ripped in strips and staggered as they were assembled. Now, because they are staggered in this way, I think the intention is that they no longer create the radiating effect that the campo flutes we saw before do. They don't direct, or they're not intended to direct the eye either in or out. Now, we felt it was very important that the frame be carved by hand, especially for a painting in which the hand of the artist is so strongly evident. The touch of the chisel in this frame reflects the stroke of the brush. Now let's look at the edge. And now we're looking down, as you see, the outer hollow section. This simple outer hollow was carved by hand, and even the outside surface of the frame itself was carved by hand. If it hadn't been, if it had been run on machine tools, the line would have been absolutely regular and I think rather boring. As it is, it bears the evidence of the hand of the artisan who made it, and to some degree, I think it reflects the way Monet painted architecture. There are no straight lines whatsoever. The frame is gilded with white gold leaf. The leaf is laid on blue bowl, blue clay. I think yellow gold, which would have been conventional, was entirely out of the question since it would have no relationship to the picture. A painted frame might have been an option. In fact, I think a painted frame could have been quite successful, but we felt that in the museum gallery context, a painted frame would call too much attention to itself. The most important point about this frame and how it was designed is that it was designed to present this picture and no other picture in the most sympathetic way possible. In order to get to this point, we had to make a number of preliminary tests to get the forms right, to get the tones right, the finish. We had, in fact, never seen or made a frame quite like it before. So this was, for us, a very rare opportunity.
And in closing, I think that when somebody like me is framing pictures for museum galleries as opposed to the home, I do take into consideration the scale of our galleries, the light, the fact that only pictures are hanging on the walls. There is no furniture, so that the frame, I'm much more interested in the frame referring to the picture or emanating out from the picture, and not all those compelling reasons why collectors might want the frame to be the transitional object to the furniture and the decorative objects in the room. The frame obviously hovers between the room and the picture, and in that role has a critical function, and I think in this regard is wonderfully demonstrative of the brushwork and the painting as Judd talked about, but the scale of the place that we intend for it to hang. And we'd love to know what you think about all this. That's it.